There are only so many different facets of your own personality that you can get to, and you find yourself repeating yourself, so it's...
At the age of 83, Paul Newman made a startling revelation about his secret homosexual relationships with some of the most famous actors of old Hollywood. Summer 2008, Westport, Connecticut. Paul Newman, a living legend of Hollywood, lay in his sickbed, enduring each wave of pain. Every afternoon, he asked for a Panasonic tape recorder to be placed by his pillow. Not to write a memoir, not to film a documentary, but to confess an unexpected truth: 6 secret homosexual affairs with some of Hollywood's most celebrated male stars. Some once held his hand in the night swearing eternal love, only to quietly send copies of his love letters to tabloid reporters for blackmail the next morning. Others recorded every private conversation, threatening that if he spoke up, Hollywood would brand him a delusional liar. So who were they? And why did Paul keep this hidden until his final days? The first name he mentioned on tape was none other than Marlon Brando. 1. Marlon Brando, a love steeped in passion and bitterness. They first met in 1961 at a charity gala at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. Paul, as always, was impeccably dressed, attending with his wife, Joanne Woodward. Brando arrived late wearing a wrinkled shirt, his gaze a mix of mockery and coldness, standing behind Paul for most of the evening. Breaking the ice. Brando said, "I thought you'd be as dull as the articles make you out to be. Turns out you're the only one here, not pretending." For the first time, Paul, usually guarded against flattery, didn't push back. From casual coffee in Westwood to night walks around Silver Lake to sudden secret flights to Palm Springs, an undefinable bond began to form. Paul loved with sincerity and commitment. Brando did not. To Brando, love was just another role to play. On August 3, 2008, Paul recorded, "He didn't love like other people do. He'd pull me out of my familiar world and drop me into rooms full of strangers, in situations I didn't understand, under gazes I couldn't control. These meetings often took place at discreet Laurel Canyon mansions or short-term rentals in Venice Beach, always involving directors, journalists, producers, along with vague promises of new films, awards, and fame." At first, Paul thought they were just parties, but he eventually realized he was merely a supporting character in Brando's behind-the-scenes scripts, a presence kept only as long as he was useful for stirring media attention. The most devastating blow came when Brando himself leaked details from Paul's private, tender, handwritten letters to Mark Weller, a paparazzo for the Los Angeles Mirror. In 1965, the paper ran an anonymous column titled "Love Behind the Lens," about a world-famous leading man, Venice Award winner, torn between family life and a secret affair with a dark-haired film icon. Everyone guessed it was Paul, except Paul, who never suspected Brando had dropped the envelope at the newsroom front desk. Why? Because Brando needed a scandal. He needed to be talked about. He needed the press to dig up old photos and stories just to make sure the name Marlon Brando never faded from public memory. And Paul, who had loved, trusted, and kept silent, became the price of Brando's vanity. The deepest cut came when Joanne, Paul's devoted wife, stumbled upon a copy of the letter in a bookshelf. She said nothing, leaving only a note. "If you need a refuge, I'm still here. But if you need another lie, I'm not the one who can give it." That winter in Connecticut, Paul hardly left the house for weeks. His daughter, Nell Newman, recalled how he would wake up in the middle of the night, step quietly onto the back porch, and smoke alone in the biting cold. No one asked questions, but everyone knew. Near the end of the tapes, Paul said, "I once thought that if I was patient enough, if I loved him long enough, he would change." But Brando never changed. He could only turn genuine emotions into tools for survival. And I let him make me one of those tools, even though I knew I didn't deserve it. Then with a sigh, he added, "I loved him in a way no one should ever love anyone." The story with Brando didn't end with a fight or a breakup. But with silence, Paul stopped answering his calls, stopped writing letters, and stopped believing love could change a person. But the regret never left. And not everyone who entered Paul's life left him wounded. There was one man who came not as a lover, but as a storm of power and possession. A man who once publicly defended him, only to later use that very protection to control everything. That man was Steve McQueen. 2. Steve McQueen, when love becomes a fire that burns them both. Steve McQueen, that bastard. Paul Newman spat out the words as if compressing a lifetime of rage into each syllable. It wasn't anger over a single comment or act. It was fury over an entire past manipulated, suppressed, and burned alive in a love both passionate and toxic to the point of suffocation. They first met backstage at the Photoplay Awards in 1956. Paul was already a married man while Steve was just a young actor, sharpening his reputation in minor TV roles. Yet the way Steve looked at Paul, bold, raw, and possessive, made it impossible for him to turn away. Soon fleeting encounters became hours-long secret meetings at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. Paul once said on tape, "I thought he loved me." But then I realized he just needed someone to prove he could own Newman. When Confidential magazine published a rumor in 1962 that Steve McQueen had an unusually close relationship with a male actor in New York, Steve acted quickly. Within a week, he was seen hand in hand with Anne Margaret at the premiere of The War Lover. At the same time, Paul was handed a non-disclosure agreement presented by Steve's own lawyer. "You know what happens to people who get exposed, right?" Steve whispered as he slid the paper across. "You have a family, a daughter. Don't let it all collapse because you got weak." He didn't just threaten. He erased every trace. With money lawyers and shadowy connections in the media. Once, Paul stumbled upon a payment of over $15,000 Steve had sent to a Variety editor to never mention the name Newman in an investigative piece. But the cruelest act was yet to come. In 1965, appearing on the Merv Griffin show, Steve smirked when asked about a rumor of a man who had once obsessed over him. "I don't remember his name," he said with a sneer. "Probably some overzealous fan. The kind who sends love letters, knocks on my door at midnight. A little scary." Paul heard it, and he understood. Steve hadn't just erased the past. He'd burned it, then shoved the ashes into someone else's mouth. In one confrontation backstage during the filming of The Towering Inferno in 1973, Paul shouted, "Why did you make me look insane to the whole world?" Steve only laughed, opened a drawer, and tossed out a cassette tape. "Just insurance. If you ever say something wrong, I've got proof to answer it all." He had secretly recorded every private conversation, every argument, every confession of love, every moment of vulnerability, all of it stored as an arsenal ready to unleash if Paul ever betrayed him. When Steve married Ali McGraw in 1973, Paul said nothing. But days later, a gift box arrived at Steve's home. Inside was a torn shirt Steve had worn after a drunken night at Paul's cabin in Vermont. Still marked with blood, the scent of liquor and lipstick stains. It wasn't a gift. It was a final warning. Paul once choked up on tape, he used love like a knife. Every embrace was a cut. And yet I couldn't stop coming back. I still loved him, even knowing he'd be the one to kill me if I let him one step closer. And then, as if fate refused to grant Paul a moment's peace, the next man to enter his life was the complete opposite. Robert Redford, gentle, warm, loving, like a sad song. Yet the story still ended in betrayal. 3. Robert Redford, A Love Betrayed Before Millions. In 1969, Hollywood was swept up in cowboy fever with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The press called it the most perfect pairing of two men ever seen on screen. Paul Newman was Butch, charming, clever, and sly. Robert Redford was Sundance, cool, sharp, and dangerous. But few knew that during those late May days, filming in Zion National Park, Utah, something else was quietly unfolding whenever the cameras stopped rolling. A love story that was never in the script. Paul, then 44, lived with his wife Joanne Woodward in Connecticut. Redford, just 32, was married to Lola Van Wagenen and father to 3 young children. Both were family men. Yet, there was an inexplicable pull between them. They sought each other out at crew meals, silently waited for the next scene just to stand close, brush shoulders, or simply hold each other's gaze a few seconds longer than necessary. One weekend night, when the crew was staying at a small lodge in Springdale, Utah, lighting technician Dennis Corbin recalled seeing Paul standing outside Redford's balcony at midnight, cigarette in hand, eyes red. I didn't dare ask. But I saw Robert open the door, pull him inside, and they disappeared. It wouldn't be the last time. From 1970 to the early 1980s, they lived parallel lives, legendary co-stars by day, secret lovers by night. But only one of them believed the relationship was real. The other wanted to keep it hidden. In a recording dated July 14, 2008, Paul confessed, "We both had wives, children, reputations, but I loved him with a kind of love that didn't fit into any mold. I thought if I stayed silent long enough, if I waited patiently enough, someday he'd hold my hand in the light the way he held it in the dark." That day never came. In 1976, Paul planned to share the truth with Stephen Close, a New Yorker journalist who had written a long profile on him the year before, at the Algonquin Hotel in Manhattan. Just hours before the scheduled interview, Paul received a call from Redford's representatives. "If you say a single word about that, you'll lose everything." That same evening, Close received an anonymous fax accusing Paul of being mentally unstable, dependent on prescription alcohol, and having shoved a female assistant while drunk. The interview was canceled. Paul's career began to stall without explanation. Weeks later, the Palm Springs tabloid The Daily Star ran a story about a veteran star shunned by a former co-star due to signs of violence and emotional instability. No names were mentioned, but the industry knew. Redford, the co-star Paul had once championed, remained completely silent. At the 1980 BAFTA Awards, when a BBC reporter asked, "Do you still keep in touch with Paul Redford?" replied casually, "We once made something great together. But everyone has to move on." He turned away before another question could be asked. And Paul? He returned home and wrote in his diary, his handwriting unsteady. "The man who once called me his light now uses me as darkness to shield his public image. He didn't just deny me. He broke the part of me that was real, the part I couldn't bring into the light without him." That love did not end with a breakup. It ended with a silence carefully engineered. A silence that lasted until the coffin was shut. One might think Redford marked the peak of Paul's heartbreak. But no, the next name Paul mentioned belonged to a man who, at just 24, had made America weep. A young soul, rebellious, burning bright, gone far too soon. Have you guessed who it is? 4. James Dean, the companion and the fateful night in Mexico for Paul Newman. James Dean was not his most scandalous affair, but it was the one that hurt him the most. A love that began with admiration, grew through shared understanding, and ended in a kind of heartbreak a person carries to their grave. They met in the spring of 1955 on the cold cement floor of the Warner Brothers backlot. Paul was 30, starring in Somebody Up There Likes Me. James, just 24, was a rising star after East of Eden. They should have been rivals, but James's first look at Paul was not one of competition. It was wonder. And then a smile that kept Paul awake for 3 nights straight. They began seeing each other more often, sometimes in a quiet corner of an all-night diner on Ventura Boulevard, sometimes on aimless drives in James's brand-new Porsche 550. Afternoons spent lying in a wooden cabin in Ojai, listening to La Boheme, pretending to rehearse lines. In truth, every line was a confession of love neither dared to name. One rainy night, after leaving the premiere, a rebel without a cause, James told Paul, "I don't need anyone to understand me. I just need you not to pretend with me." Paul didn't reply. He simply took the young man's hand and placed it over his chest where his heart was pounding. But life doesn't leave beautiful love stories untouched. That June, an unknown paparazzo named Eddie Prescott snapped a photo of them kissing through the window of a parked car near Sunset Strip. No paper dared publish it outright, but within days the gossip column, Shadow Lovers, of the silver screen in the Los Angeles Herald-Express had all of Hollywood buzzing. No names were given, but everyone knew. James was immediately dropped from a promotional contract with Warner Brother, and Paul was pulled from a George Stevens project. Worse was the reaction from within the industry itself. A studio executive faxed Paul directly. "If you don't want to sink like Montgomery Clift, you'd better teach your wife to hold your hand in public." James spiraled. He began avoiding Paul. Calls went unanswered, letters unreturned. One night Paul stood at James's doorstep for hours, knocking. No one came. Only a small note was wedged in the doorframe, the handwriting shaky, "I don't deserve to live, if living in your eyes is wrong." 3 days later, James was hospitalized for a sleeping pill overdose. He was saved, but the press didn't relent. Daily Variety ran, "Young actor suffers severe emotional disturbance." A New York Post columnist wrote coldly, "James Dean should learn to be a man before being an idol." Paul was no less shattered. He was torn between 2 worlds. Fame career and his home with Joanne Woodward on one side, and a dying love on the other. He didn't know how to save James without dragging them both into ruin. In September, James sent one final message, Mexico City. "Friday. If you don't come, I'll understand." Paul didn't go. He was in New York preparing for a Life magazine photo shoot with Joanne. He held the ticket in his hand, went as far as LaGuardia Airport, then turned back. Out of fear, out of weakness, out of an inability to destroy everything he had built. On September 30th, 1955, James Dean died in a car crash in Cholame, California. CBS announced it in the 8 p.m. radio bulletin. Paul heard it in his hotel room at the plaza. He didn't eat or sleep for 3 days. In a summer 2008 recording, Paul recounted, "I stared at my hands. They weren't shaking, no tears, just one question over and over. Why didn't I get on that plane? If I had gone, would he still be alive?" From that day, Paul never mentioned James Dean again. But family members said that whenever he was drunk, he would look up at the ceiling and whisper, "I'm sorry. You should have lived a brilliant life." And for the rest of his life, Paul kept in his bedside drawer a faded handkerchief, the only thing left from their last trip to Ojai. 5. Sal Mineo, a young love strangled by prejudice. At that time, Paul Newman was a man torn apart inside. Outwardly, he remained polite still, an icon, still America's model husband. But inside, he had collapsed. After Steve, he had fallen into a pit of self-loathing. The man who once loved quietly had become someone who saw deceit, violation, and manipulation everywhere he looked. In September 1974, on the discreet recommendation of Joanne, his ever-silent, ever-forgiving wife, Paul sought out a psychologist in West Hollywood. He didn't say much, only sighed. "I'm so tired. I need a place to breathe." And there on a rainy afternoon, the color of ash, Sal Mineo walked in. By then, Sal had long stepped away from the bright lights. After Rebel Without a Cause, he was once hailed as the second James Dean. But because he so resembled James, he suffered the same fate pushed out by Hollywood for being too sensitive, too fragile, too real, and because of whispers about his sexuality. "You're in therapy too?" Paul asked. Sal nodded, pointing to his temple. "Not to cure an illness, but to cure what they've made me believe is an illness." From then on, after every session, they would take walks together. No hugs, no kisses, no flirting. Just two lonely men trying to breathe normally in a world that put unnatural pressure on them. Once Sal slipped a small note into Paul's pocket. "If they call you a freak, then I'd like to be a freak with you." Their love came softly, not as urgent as Steve, not as fierce as Brando. Every morning, Paul would find a handwritten note by his door in which Sal wrote, "Did you sleep well? I sometimes wonder if you woke up tomorrow and I wasn't here." "Would you come looking for me?" Paul once admitted. Sal was the first person I didn't feel the need to hide from. When I was with him, I forgot I was Paul Newman. They had planned to go to Venice together in the spring of 1976. Sal wanted to write a screenplay for them both. A story about two men finding each other in a city drowning in floodwaters. But that trip never happened. On the night of February 12, 1976, Sal was stabbed to death outside his West Hollywood apartment, returning from a rehearsal of P.S. Your Cat is Dead. His killer was an unknown young man. Police initially called it a robbery. But Paul knew it was the fate of someone who dared to live truthfully. When he heard the news, Paul stayed silent for 3 days. He spoke to no one, only sat on the rooftop staring down at the city. And in a recorded tape, his voice shook. I thought I was the one healing him. But it was Sal who pulled me out of the abyss. He wanted nothing from me, only for me to be myself. And I never got to thank him. Husks. Montgomery Clift, the final love and the pain without a name. I used to think nothing could destroy me. Until the day Joanne stood in front of me, trembling, holding the letter she'd found under my pillow. A handwritten note from Monty in blue ink with slanted script signed with his full name. I had never seen eyes so broken. In 1966, while Paul was filming Hombre in Tucson, Arizona, Joanne Woodward flew to the set without warning. In her hand was an opened envelope. No accusations, no tears. Just one question. "So this is why you've been losing sleep for the past 2 years?" Montgomery Clift had been sending Paul secret letters after each of their meetings. They weren't love notes, but tear-stained monologues. In one, Monty wrote, "I don't need you to choose me, only not to deny that I exist." Joanne had read them all. Worse, one letter was discovered by a wardrobe assistant and leaked to the National Enquirer reporter Clara Jenkins. That November, the press exploded with a screaming headline, "Paul Newman and Monty Clift. The Buried Truth." 20th Century Fox immediately issued a formal demand for Paul to clarify extramarital relationships that could impact his commercial image. Joanne moved out within 48 hours, leaving behind a folded note with a single line. "If you choose to live with lies, at least don't drag me with you." Paul nearly lost his mind. Not because the truth had come out, but because he had failed to protect anyone, not Joanne, not Monty, and certainly not himself. Days later, Monty called from New York. His voice was tired but firm. "I'm sorry, but I can't take this anymore. I don't want to live as a shadow. I don't want to be your secret." Paul begged Monty to fly to Los Angeles, promising to move to start over, even to go public if necessary. But Monty refused. Less than a month later, on January 23, 1967, Paul received a call from Monty's close friend actor, Kevin McCarthy. The voice on the line was choked. "Monty's in the hospital." He swallowed a handful of sleeping pills. "They saved him. But he doesn't want to speak to anyone anymore. Especially not you." Paul completely broke down. In just 4 weeks, he lost his wife. His lover was hounded by the press, had his cool hand. Luke contract delayed for personal reasons and was sued by Universal Studios for breach of moral image clause, demanding $1.2 million. A staggering sum for the time. Paul was secretly admitted to a psychiatric rehabilitation center in rural Connecticut under an alias. His file diagnosed him with severe anxiety disorder, following emotional trauma, nervous exhaustion accompanied by self-denial. No one knew. He had paid an entire legal and PR team to erase every trace. His private psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Hale, later wrote in his leaked journal, "He doesn't want to live, but he doesn't dare to die. It is the most terrifying state I have ever witnessed." Monty did not wait for him to recover. 9 years later, on a cold February night in 1976, Montgomery Clift was found dead in his West Hollywood apartment from a heart attack after a phone call that ended in screaming. He was gone. And I kept living trapped forever in the moment I didn't take his hand. I thought I was strong. But in the end, I was just a coward who loved. The tape ends there. No continuation. And perhaps that's why it became the most haunting fragment of Paul Newman's life. A man who buried his flawed loves for half a century and only dared to speak when his remaining days could be counted in weeks. Paul Newman passed away, taking with him tapes that were never made public. The names, the loves, the wounds remain there in the shadows of a glamorous yet deceitful Hollywood. He once said, "I'm not telling this to be forgiven. I'm telling it so I won't be forgotten." And now you are the one hearing that final confession. But what do you think? In this story, how much is the truth, and how much is merely the torment of a soul counting down its final breaths? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, share it with those who once idolized Paul Newman, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter.